Welcome to the ASCO e-learning weekly podcast, a weekly educational series focused on helping learners identify knowledge gaps and stay up to date with the latest in new drug developments, cancer treatments, and patient care approaches. This episode is complementary to an education session presented at the 2019 annual meeting. For more detailed information about the education session, make sure to check the episode description for links to ASCO's meeting library.
Our next presenter is Dr. Ashley Love Sumrall, whose title of their presentation is I Promised. Dr. Sumrall is the Section Chief of Neuro-Oncology at the Levine Cancer Institute at Atrium Health in Charlotte, North Carolina. She completed the ASCO Leadership Development Program and is looking forward to being more involved in ASCO as a member of the Clinical Practice Committee. Dr. Sumrall.
Thank you. He told me to do it for him. Step out of your comfort zone. Put your reputation on the line. What can you lose? And so I promised. I should back up. I was in my first attending job in Charlotte. Several months in, working through a busy clinic one day when my pager interrupted me. I was called to review an MRI. As a neuro-oncologist, I'm often asked to give advice. My colleague on the line told me, I have a sick patient in the hospital. It's very complicated, and he summarized the history. He's been on a vaccine trial on the West Coast, but he's also been treated on the East Coast. It was complicated. He'd been managed by 3 care teams, all from centers I knew and doctors I knew by name. He had a local oncologist who served as referee, and I was new. I felt out of place. I felt awkward. Reluctantly, I agreed. I stopped clinic. I pulled up the scans and looked, and there it was, a terrible tumor. He had had a low-grade glioma, but I now suspected it was a grade 4. I knew what he needed. I made some phone recs, tried to make it easy, put him on some steroids. Nope. He won't do that. Anything but that. He wants to see you. Well, I had a full day of clinic, so I planned to walk over after, and clinic, especially mine, often runs late. 7 p.m., I walked over to the hospital, expecting a challenge. When I walked in and introduced myself, I was taken aback. The kindest brown eyes looked at me. He smiled. I'm David. I've been waiting to meet you, he said. We got down to business, anything but steroids. I said, why? They make me crazy. I can't. It is worse than death. What? I don't want my children to see me that way, he explained. When I asked about his other doctors, he shrugged. I'm in your hands now. I stayed for at least 2 hours that night. He'd been diagnosed with a low-grade glioma in 2003. He was working in D.C. for the White House. 7 years later, it grew. He had another surgery. He went to the East Coast. Chemo and radiation, clinical trials. He traveled to California. He went on a phase 1 trial of a retroviral replicating vector injected directly into the brain. That lasted for 5 months. He had another craniotomy. By now we're up to craniotomy number 4. Another trial was planned for another vaccine, but in a month he progressed. Found himself in our hospital. Sitting in his room, we searched high and low for trial options. I sat beside him on the bed. There were none. He was excluded. On days 2 and 3, I returned. Now, I knew there was something different about David, and he revealed himself to me piece by piece. A celebrity of sorts, he had an impressive virtual Rolodex. Known for his deep faith, his sense of humor, and ability to build relationships, I watched as people came in and out. And surely I stared one night when a well-known pastor walked into his room. He sat on his bed, and he listened. He prayed with him. He prayed for him. He put his hand on me and prayed for me. And this became an unofficial recurring meeting. Every night, the three of us would sit. We talked about research one night in clinical trials. And David reminded me, I've been given time due to clinical trials and the fruits of clinical trials. I shared with him about the trials process, and for everyone in the room who conducts trials, you know, networking, paperwork, time away from family, meetings, travel, not enough collaboration. Hours of work in a highly competitive field, and egos. Egos where there shouldn't be. I confessed to him that I seldom felt enough. David told me, Ashley, you have no choice. You must do this for me. Get out of your comfort zone. Get over yourself. And I promised. I lobbied to give him expensive therapy in the hospital. It worked. He went to rehab. On the day that he took his first steps, he spiked a fever. Back to the hospital we went, into the ICU. He had a brain infection. Steroids were inevitable. I sat on his bed, and he cried. I don't want their last memory of me to be this way. He sobbed. I choked back my own tears. We compromised on little doses so that he could be awake. He worsened. I walked out into the hallway. I held his wife as she drenched my shoulder in tears. Exhausted yet confident, he told me he had decided. He made some jokes in his usual manner, and he said, I think I'm doing the right thing. Am I ready? What will heaven be like? And I stood at the foot of his bed. Time stood still. David, I'm stopping your antibiotics. He smiled. I told him it's time. With tears in his eyes, he mouthed, I love you. Relief and grief washed over him in that moment. His beautiful wife draped at his side. He sobbed. Thank you, he whispered. Unable to make another sound, he closed his eyes. Tears dripped down my cheeks, and I turned and walked away, unsure how I could do this ever again. But somehow I did. As he transitioned to inpatient hospice and passed away, I remembered. David told me to do it for him. I have no choice. I did. I still do, because I promised. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the ASCO eLearning Weekly Podcast. To make us part of your weekly routine, click subscribe. Let us know what you think by leaving a review. For more information, visit the Comprehensive eLearning Center at elearning.asco.org. The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. This is not a substitute for medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.